Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. In this episode, Enrica Perucchietti and Roberto Quaglia turn their attention to one of the most celebrated yet controversial figures of contemporary documentary cinema, Michael Moore. Through films such as Bowling for Columbine and Fahrenheit 9/11, Moore has been widely regarded as a critical voice within American culture, capable of challenging power structures from within the system itself. But the hosts ask a more uncomfortable question. What if this form of dissent is not as disruptive as it appears? What if, instead of breaking the narrative, it ultimately helps to contain it? Moving between cinema, politics, and media strategy, the episode explores the thin line between criticism and integration, between opposition and managed consensus, and asks whether some of the most iconic works of anti-establishment cinema may, in fact, function as part of the very system they seem to question. Enrica Perucchietti opens the episode by revisiting the path traced in previous installments of Hollywood propaganda, where the discussion focused on films that, in one way or another, seem to anticipate, foreshadow, or frame the events of September 11, 2001. The most recent episode had centered in particular on the television series Designated Survivor, interpreted as an allegory of 9/11, and had also touched on the contentious issue of the gun debate in the United States. Building on this thread, the host introduces the central theme of the new episode, the documentary cinema of Michael Moore, a controversial figure in the American cultural landscape whose work sits at the intersection of social critique and institutionally tolerated narrative. Before delving into the documentaries themselves, the two hosts pause to examine Michael Moore's public persona, raising what they consider a crucial question. Can a genuine dissident win an Academy Award in the United States? Their implicit answer is negative, or at the very least, ambiguous. Roberto Quaglia observes that Moore has long been portrayed as a great heretic, a conspiracy theorist, a dissenter, and that he has been the target of relentless criticism, treatment that, in some respects, mirrors what the hosts of Hollywood propaganda themselves experience. And yet Moore wins an Oscar, a fact they consider highly revealing in its own right. Quaglia clarifies his position. This is not about accusing Moore of bad faith or of consciously acting as an agent of the system. The mechanism, he argues, is more subtle. In his view, the system selects figures who are functional to its narrative, and Moore fits those criteria without any need for explicit agreement or covert allegiance. What matters is that he remains within certain boundaries, refraining from pushing beyond them. His critique, however forceful in tone, never truly threatens the deeper structures of power. At this point, the hosts briefly digress into the Italian debate surrounding the figure of the so-called gatekeeper, a term used in alternative media circles to describe individuals who appear to operate within dissent while in fact managing and containing it from within. Perucchietti notes that in Italy there is an overabundance of debate about who is, or isn't a gatekeeper, discussions she finds somewhat laughable. In the United States, by contrast, the case of Michael Moore offers a far more concrete and less speculative answer. The awards he has received, the media visibility he enjoys, and the treatment he receives from the mainstream press are objective elements that place him in a clearly defined position. Not necessarily that of a conscious agent, but certainly that of a figure whose dissent is systemically functional, and therefore tolerated, promoted, and rewarded. As further support for this interpretation, the hosts cite a revealing episode. Alex Jones, the well-known American commentator often labeled a conspiracy theorist, once confronted Moore in an ambush-style interview, asking why he had never addressed 9/11 from the critical perspective of those who question official narratives. Moore's response, in an apparent attempt to deflect, was that engaging with the topic in those terms would be un-American. According to the hosts, this expression, difficult to translate neatly into Italian, points to what they see as the only truly unforgivable offense in the American cultural industry, challenging the nation's foundational myths. Quaglia notes, however, that this answer might have carried some coherence had Moore simply avoided the topic altogether. Instead, Moore directed Fahrenheit 9/11, a documentary entirely devoted to the events of September 11th and their political implications. His response to Alex Jones therefore appears contradictory, or at least insufficient. Perucchietti and Quaglia interpret this episode as the candid reflection of a creator who fully understands the limits within which he operates, and respects them not out of external constraint, but out of an awareness of his role within the dominant cultural system. The first of Moore's documentaries analyzed in the episode is Bowling for Columbine, the 2002 film that won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 2003 and was also presented in competition at the Cannes Film Festival, where it received the 55th anniversary prize. The film addresses the issue of gun use in the United States and takes its cue, already in the title, from the massacre that took place in April 1999 at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, where two students armed with rifles entered their school, killed 12 classmates and a teacher, and then took their own lives. The documentary follows Moore on a journey across the United States in search of the cultural and social roots of American gun violence. Among its notable moments is an interview with Marilyn Manson, the rock musician who at the time had been accused, through the lyrics of his songs, of somehow influencing the perpetrators of the massacre. However, the segment that left the strongest impression on both hosts is the final interview with Charlton Heston, the former actor and then president of the National Rifle Association, the powerful American organization representing gun manufacturers and owners. Quaglia recalls seeing the film in theaters upon its release and never watching it again. He describes the interview with Heston as literally uncomfortable to watch. Moore confronts the elderly actor with aggressive, almost insulting questions, behavior the hosts describe as rude and unjustifiable. Perucchietti explicitly refers to it as 2 minutes of hate, inserted into the film, echoing Orwell's famous expression, and points out that a person of advanced age is objectively less able to defend themselves in such a confrontation. The entire episode is interpreted as serving a precise purpose: to stir visceral reactions in the audience against a particular segment of society, namely, traditional, conservative, gun-owning America. The hosts do not deny the existence of a real problem related to the ease with which firearms can be accessed in the United States, even by minors, individuals with criminal records, or those suffering from mental health issues. They acknowledge the complexity of the issue. However, they argue that Moore, by demonizing the weapon itself, ultimately plays into the hands of that segment of the elite which has long sought to disarm the American population. The right to bear arms, they note, is enshrined in the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution and was included by the Founding Fathers precisely so that future citizens could defend themselves against potentially corrupt rulers. Removing this right, in the host's view, means depriving the people of a fundamental tool of resistance against abuses of power. In support of this argument, they point to an example Moore himself presents in the documentary. In Canada, the availability of firearms is comparable to that of the United States, yet the rate of gun violence is dramatically lower. Similarly, in Switzerland, where citizens are commonly armed due to mandatory military service that requires soldiers to keep their weapons at home, mass shootings are virtually non-existent. The conclusion the hosts draw is that the issue lies not in the weapon itself, but in the nature of the society. Economic inequality, low levels of social cohesion, the quality of education, and unresolved structural problems. By demonizing firearms instead of addressing these underlying issues, Perucchietti and Quaglia argue, attention is diverted from the real causes in favor of a political objective, disarming the population, that ultimately serves the interests of elites more than those of ordinary citizens. The second documentary examined is Fahrenheit 9/11, the 2004 film that won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. Its title explicitly echoes Ray Bradbury's celebrated science fiction novel Fahrenheit 451, though the hosts point out that Bradbury himself was reportedly outraged by this appropriation, repeatedly demanding an apology for more and a change of title, requests that were never granted. Quaglia remarks that while the title is undeniably brilliant, its use for this film amounts to a rather indecorous misuse of an excellent idea. The documentary presents itself as an investigation into the hidden background of 9/11, focusing in particular on the ties between the Bush family and the bin Laden family, as well as on the political responsibilities of President George W. Bush. A large portion of the film is devoted to constructing an image of Bush as fundamentally unfit for office, dim-witted, incapable, practically senile, in Quaglia's blunt phrasing, and to portraying the economic and personal links between the two families as the key to interpreting the events. Perucchietti recalls awaiting the documentary with great anticipation during its production, convinced it would finally bring uncomfortable and explosive truths to light. The disappointment, she says, was total. Quaglia describes the film as a massive letdown, something he could hardly believe he was watching. In their view, more deliberately chooses to focus on the two figures, Bush and bin Laden, who had the least to do with the deeper mechanisms behind 9/11. The result, they argue, is a kind of dreamlike catharsis, a surrogate form of justice that emotionally satisfies a progressive audience while revealing nothing truly substantial. Quaglia is particularly explicit. One of the documentary's central figures was, in his opinion, likely too unintelligent to orchestrate anything of that magnitude, while the other, Osama bin Laden, did not exist in the terms presented by the official narrative. In both cases, the hosts suggest these figures function as scapegoats, projections designed to channel public outrage toward harmless targets while leaving the real centers of decision-making untouched. This interpretation is reinforced, they argue, by the film's media rollout. When Moore accepted the Oscar for Bowling for Columbine, he launched a striking attack on George W. Bush from the stage itself, publicly calling him a fool. That moment, broadcast and rebroadcast across global media, is interpreted by the hosts not as the spontaneous outburst of an unbalanced individual, because, they note, in that case it would never have been replayed on a loop, but as part of a script. In their view, it functioned as the most powerful promotional launch imaginable for Fahrenheit 9/11, generating anticipation and global resonance. The hosts also highlight what they see as a revealing asymmetry in the media system. It tolerates insults directed at Republicans far more readily than those aimed at Democrats. Had Moore attacked Barack Obama in the same context and with the same intensity, they argue, his microphone would have been cut immediately and the scene would never have aired. The reason, they suggest, is straightforward. Within the dominant narrative of the time, Obama played the role of the good cop, while George Bush was cast as the villain. Bush became the designated target, the scapegoat upon whom it was not only acceptable but encouraged to unload every fault. And yet, the hosts add, viewed without the filter of propaganda, Bush did not appear particularly malevolent. Rather, he came across as a somewhat simple, even affable figure, widely described by those who knew him personally as genuinely personable. In their reading, he was demonized by the very forces that manipulated him, precisely because a visible face was needed to absorb public indignation. From here, The discussion broadens to the concept of anti-Americanism, invoked by Moore in his response to Alex Jones as an uncrossable boundary. Quaglia explains that the post-war relationship between the Pentagon and Hollywood producers amounted to a structured and explicit pact. Studios and filmmakers were granted broad creative freedom, the ability to tell uncomfortable stories, criticize individual politicians or policies, and explore controversial themes, so long as they did not cross into content perceived as anti-American. In return, the Pentagon provided access to military equipment, locations, personnel, and an implicit form of institutional endorsement. This arrangement, he argues, shaped American cinema for decades, defining the invisible boundaries within which filmmakers could move freely and beyond which they could not go. Quaglia adds that the concept of anti-Americanism is so nuanced and distant from European political categories that it would require an entire episode to unpack properly. It is, they explain, a notion that resists simple translation. It is not merely about criticizing American policy, but about challenging the nation's foundational mythology, its identity narrative, its founding myths. It is the difference between targeting a president and targeting the system that produces him, between criticizing a war and questioning America's right to wage it, between denouncing an abuse and interrogating the legitimacy of the entire order that makes such an abuse possible. This, they argue, is precisely the boundary Moore never crosses, despite the apparent radicalism of his work. His critiques strike at individual presidents, specific policies, and visible figures, but never at the deep structures of American power. They do not challenge foundational myths, nor do they question the legitimacy of the system as a whole. For this reason, the hosts contend, his dissent is not only tolerated but encouraged. It serves as a pressure valve, channeling dissatisfaction towards safe targets and preventing it from crystallizing into a more radical and potentially destabilizing critique. The discussion then expands to school shootings as a broader phenomenon, with particular attention to the Columbine massacre, which the hosts describe as the first, or at least one of the first and most heavily publicized, events of its kind. Quaglia notes that Alex Jones had also covered the case, pointing out that certain aspects remained classified as state secrets, such as transcripts of parental interrogations and documents withheld from public access, which, in his view, raised troubling suspicions about possible covert operations behind such events. The hosts do not delve into the specifics of alternative theories surrounding Columbine, but they argue that if Moore had truly intended to serve the truth, he could at least have introduced these elements into the documentary, these unresolved, shadowy aspects. Instead, they say he chose to focus on demonizing firearms and on his confrontation with Heston, striking a visible target without scratching beneath the surface. Jones was financially and publicly ruined by legal action tied to his statements about school shootings, particularly the Sandy Hook massacre, and was ultimately forced to issue public retractions. Quaglia interprets this outcome as a deliberate warning, punish one to instruct many. The result, he suggests, is that few commentators have since been willing to address these issues with comparable intensity. The contrast with Moore, in the host's view, is telling. Moore addresses these topics in a superficial manner, never truly disturbing the structures of power, and wins an Oscar. Jones crosses the permitted boundaries and is destroyed. In the final part of the episode, the hosts turn their attention to the figure of George W. Bush, noting how Moore's documentary portrays him as the primary culprit, or at least the symbolic face, of what occurred. They reject this interpretation as superficial and, ultimately, functional to the system itself. Quaglia describes Bush Jr. as a genuinely simple man, almost likable in his simplicity, and recalls the well-known footage, easily found online, in which the president is informed of the September 11th attacks while sitting in an elementary school classroom, listening to children read. His reaction, one of total bewilderment, seemingly unable to grasp what to do, stands, for Quaglia, as clear evidence that he had no prior knowledge of the events, and was therefore the least culpable in any direct sense. According to the hosts, the real decision-makers operated behind the scenes. Bush Jr. was used as a scapegoat, demonized by the very forces pulling the strings, a mechanism that allows the system to offload responsibility onto a visible figure while keeping the true centers of power in the shadows. The fact that Moore devotes an entire film to the relationship between Bush and bin Laden, two figures the hosts consider largely marginal to the deeper mechanisms of 9/11, reveals, in their view, very little about Bush or bin Laden, but a great deal about Moore and the function his cinema serves within the American cultural system. The discussion then shifts to George Bush Sr., the father, whom they present as a far more powerful and aware figure. Former director of the CIA, vice president at the time of the 1981 attempt on Reagan's life, and the subject of an unsettling coincidence. The man who shot Ronald Reagan was the son of an individual with whom Bush Sr. was reportedly scheduled to dine that very evening. When this detail surfaced, Bush reportedly described the situation as embarrassing. Quaglia notes that stories like this sound almost fabricated in their strangeness, yet they are documented. Bush Sr. is also remembered for delivering, on September 11, 1990, exactly 11 years before the attacks, the famous speech announcing the advent of a new world order. The hosts do not consider this alignment of dates to be coincidental. From these elements, Perucchietti and Quaglia arrive at a stark conclusion. What the world witnessed on September 11, 2001 was, in essence, a form of stage theater. Real and tragic events did occur, such as the collapse of the buildings, but the entire narrative constructed around them, the story of Bush, of bin Laden, of Islamic terrorism as the ultimate enemy, was, and remains, theatrical. In their view, Michael Moore, in his most ambitious documentary, merely scripted one segment of this broader performance. The segment designed to satisfy a left-leaning audience with an alternative version that ultimately leaves all fundamental questions untouched. Within this framework, bin Laden fulfills a role similar to that of Emmanuel Goldstein in George Orwell's 1984, the ultimate enemy, the embodiment of absolute evil onto whom the ritual 2 minutes hate can be projected, the figure that justifies extraordinary measures and the curtailment of freedoms. Quaglia notes, with irony, that Moore constructs his own 2 minutes of hate around the wrong Emmanuel Goldstein, namely Bush, the puppet, rather than the puppet masters, thereby missing the true target. Perucchietti adds a more sarcastic observation. The role of bin Laden as a kind of phantom enemy legitimizing power is not, in structural terms, so different from that of certain figures in contemporary political circles, an implicit reference to the Biden administration and its surrounding actors. The comparison, deliberately elusive, serves to suggest that the mechanism of the constructed enemy and political theater has by no means disappeared with the end of the Bush era. The hosts close the episode by summarizing their overall argument. Michael Moore's cinema is presented as a paradigmatic example of what might be called managed dissent, an opposition that is loud enough to appear authentic, yet sufficiently contained so as not to pose any real threat to the system that hosts and rewards it. The Oscar for Bowling for Columbine and the Palme d'Or for Fahrenheit 9/11 are not seen as anomalies, but rather as confirmation. The system recognizes and rewards those who function as pressure valves without ever touching the deeper structures of power. That's all for today. See you in the next episode of Hollywoodism, Movies and Propaganda, here on Compelling Topics.